Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the joint launch of the Asian Infrastructure Finance Report 2022 by Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Before we waste any further time, I would invite the Vice Chancellor PIDE, Dr. Nadeem Haque, for his welcome remarks.
Senator Musadik Malik, Minister for Petroleum, Erik Berglof from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I should correct that, and former professor of LSE. It's a great pleasure for us to work with the AIIB. When I heard about this, I jumped at it. AIIB is a new organization, a very important organization that we can say that is owned by the third world, so to speak, that a different organization that hopefully we will own and hopefully will help Pakistan. Although all multinational agencies are friends, but nevertheless, this is another one that we welcome, the new kid on the block. When we heard about that report, we thought it was wonderful to try and learn about moonshots and to learn about state capacity and mobilization. So we are extremely happy to host this event, and we hope this will be the beginning of a very good relationship, not only between PIDE and AIIB, but also AIIB and Pakistan. We are very close to China, and we would like to be very close to the AIIB too. I must also thank Minister Musadik for taking out his time. He's very kind. He always responds very nicely to PIDE requests to help us. And he's what we say is he's one of our chief friends of the thinking community in Pakistan. It's a great pleasure to welcome Minister Musadik. As you all know, he himself has a research and consulting background. So he's a great resource in terms of learning about the world and thoughts about the world. And I'm sure you'll hear from him today. I've always enjoyed interacting with him and talking with him, and it's always a learning experience. So with that, I would welcome all of you, and let's begin launching the report. Mariam.
Thank you, sir. I would now request Minister of State for Energy and Petroleum Division, Mr. Musadik Malik, for the keynote address.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, if Nadeem Haque is here, I don't know why we need anyone else. Honestly, that's what I saw him and I said, what am I doing here? There's nothing that I know and you don't, and you know a lot more than I do. So I thought in the introduction, he would take care of everything. But being the gracious host that he is, he left the field blank for me. Dr. Nadeem Haque also mentioned that we belong to the third world. What he didn't tell you that is that there are only three worlds and we're the third. So that's also a problematic thing. But I think the participation of AIIB in the development of the developing world is very welcome. It's a great sign. I think we need our own voice, and we need this voice from amongst ourselves. And I think that's the great role that AIIB would be hopefully bringing forth to the world community in terms of support and development. And the hope is that their image is the same as that of the developing countries. So we would now be talking about development in our own image rather than some external image. Honestly, when I started to think about this, I didn't know what position to take. It's a complicated thing. You start thinking about net zero, you start thinking about climate, you start thinking about environment, and your heart bleeds. We've just gone through the disasters that we've gone through, the floods and half of Pakistan getting wiped out underwater. Millions of people falling below the poverty line, their livelihoods gone, their loved ones lost, and their animals gone, their farmlands gone. So who understands the devastating impact of climate change better than Pakistan, and specifically in this particular year? So that's first thing that I want to bring to the fore, that although our carbon footprint is less than 1%, maybe 0.5%. I don't even know. It's really negligible. We don't have a carbon footprint. If you look at the average energy utilization per capita, you realize we have negligible footprint. If you look at the overall total content that we are contributing, you find out we're negligible. We're not even a print on that carbon footprint. You look at vulnerability and we're right there. There are years when we are 7th most vulnerable country in the world, and there are years when we are 3rd or 4th most vulnerable countries in the world. So this idea of climate and net zero is most important for us, for the safety, for our own sustainability, for our own safety, and for the security of our future generations, the sustainability of our future generations. So I think that's critical. We are all committed to it too. We're committed to it. We've been, this administration has been in place for about 9 months. And we've already announced 10,000 megawatts of solar. We're already struggling with it. We have specific programs. We have a program for rooftop. We have a program for 11 kV solar inputs. We have a plan for big solar parks. We have already put out a bid for 650 megawatts worth of a farm, a solar farm, and we're going to continue to expand it. We're already talking about, coal gasification projects, especially as it pertains to fertilizers, which is going to be a big need in Pakistan. So we're trying to do all the right things, and we're very hopeful that we would be good global citizens and will continue to contribute towards a net zero world in a timely fashion, and we'll certainly carry our weight. Now, this all is good news. But something else has also happened over the past couple of years. I think it began with COVID. Before COVID, we all believed, and we all believed. We still would like to believe, but now it's become a bit suspect. We all believed that we were woven into one global fabric. And the entire world convinced us that we are all interwoven. We are citizens of this world, and we have to save this planet. And it's imperative that we all, in an interwoven manner, move forward and save the future of our children. And we believed it. We believed it, and steadily we started to move forward. And then we were hit with COVID. And then we realized that we don't have the first right to vaccines. Only the developed countries of the world have the first right to vaccines. And we saw our children die. We saw our elderly die. We saw the misery. We saw pain. We kept protesting. We kept waiting. And we got a little bit after a lot of protest, a lot of voice, but not enough. So a lot of people who could have been saved weren't saved, and they died. And we challenged ourselves and asked ourselves that, are we still a part of an interwoven global fabric? Is that really true? And then you saw some geopolitical shifts more recently between Ukraine, Russia, and a whole lot of geopolitical kind of jockeying around that took place. And once again, we were left to fend for ourselves. We realized that we don't have access to petroleum products. We don't have access to energy. We realized all of a sudden that if we wanted energy for our households, for our industrial footprints, we'd have to go to the marketplace and we'll have to buy a cargo of LNG for $120 million. $120 million for 100 MMCFD of gas. Who could afford that? So obviously what happened? We were hit with the burden. When we bought, we were hit with the inflation. And when we didn't buy, we were hit with shutdowns. And we continue to scratch our heads and ask the same question. Really? Are we really a part of this global fabric that we're all talking about? Really? And sometimes one wonders if you're a part of this fabric or you're a patch on this fabric. And then I started to think about other things. I started to think about coal. I started to think about a host of other things around which we were already convinced. We were all convinced that if we move in that direction, we should move very reluctantly because that fuel has a very heavy carbon footprint. And what do we find out? That Germany has opened up coal mines. What? The coal in Pakistan is bad, the Thar coal is bad, and the German coal is white? Black and white? What is happening here? Only the developing economies kind of coal has a carbon footprint, but what about these coal mines opening up in Germany? And what about all of these coal plants which are getting energized? So again, one is left to scratch one's head. And one is left to wonder, truly, how does this work out? Should we really believe what we are told to believe? Or are we really left to our own devices? Are we the vagabonds which are going to be left out to lurk at the periphery of all the global fabric, whatever remains of it, or howsoever it's going to get defined? And it's very unclear to me, to be honest. After all of what I've seen over the past few years, it's very unclear. I mean, you go back and read history and you find out it's happening over and over and over again. It's just happening in different ways. But this time around, it was different. First, it was about life and death. And then it was about inflation, poor people of Pakistan not having the affordability to take care of their children, to put food on the table, to get medications for their parents, or to shut out completely, no energy, or limited energy, or zero energy. So we, as you guys know, in spite of all the infrastructure that we've developed, we were hit with load sheddings. We've had a very difficult, we tried to manage to the best of our capabilities. And after 10 years, I'm very happy to state that this was the first winter in which there weren't any protests for gas shortages because we had to ration. We made sure that during the breakfast time and the lunch time and the dinner time, gas was available. But it's not because we had gas. We just managed it. We actually rationed it for our people. That's how we were able to make sure that there are no protests. But for how long? For how long is this going to go on? What will be the next kind of turning point? What would be the next boomerang when something comes kind of all edgy and chops the third world kind of, or cuts it through its heart? So that's where we're at. But we're doing it. We're doing it because we're doing it for our own children. Whether we are a patch or we're a part of the global fabric, we're vulnerability, we're responsible people, we're a responsible country. So we are doing it because we are responsible, not because we are a part of the global fabric. That I assure you. So we'll have to make sure that we take care of our children, because it appears to me that no one else will. We've introduced a lot of kind of renewables. We are introducing more and more. But let me give you one more thing. As you know, I'm right now heading the inquiry for a commission which is looking at the power breakdown. And one of the hypotheses that is playing around is that we didn't have the infrastructure to take a surge of wind energy kicking in. Can you imagine? So we basically are building up this renewables kind of into our mix, but we don't have the infrastructure. So that's, I think, where AIIB comes into play. And I think we'd be very grateful if AIIB helps us do the responsible thing. AIIB, I'm sorry. And we are very hopeful that because they're thinking in the image of what I would call developing world and what my honorable friend would call the third world, because his expression has a cut and it's also more truthful. You can call it whatever you may, but actually it's the third world, because that's how we treat it. So we're very hopeful that we'll get financing. We're very hopeful that financing would take into account that people who have developed have also developed at our expense. There was a global resource which was burnt and holes were dug to make sure that the Western world develops. We didn't develop in time. We're trying to develop now. And I hope this consideration would stay in everyone's mind and heart at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would now request Dr. Erik Berglof, Chief Economist, AIIB, to present the report, Asian Infrastructure Finance Report in Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I asked, before the minister leaves the room, I just want to say I couldn't have had a better introduction to this report than you gave. And so thank you so much. And I can't say how much I share your perspective and your concerns. So thank you. And I also lived through this vaccine debacle. I lived through the implications of the war on Ukraine, and I know what you're talking about. So thank you very much for sharing this with us. Before I go into the presentation, I want to thank PIDE very much for hosting this. And this is, I'm very glad to be back in Pakistan, but this is the first time I'm in Islamabad, and I'm just overwhelmed by the generosity of welcome that I have received and the program that I will have over these couple of days. And you know, Pakistan has gone through a very rough time. I think it was so clear in the words of the minister that what you have gone through and maybe what you perceive as, and I think rightfully so, not getting always the right support and the right response from the rest of the world. And for you to give this generosity to me and to be here today is particularly meaningful. So I want to go back to what the minister was talking about, and when we were working on this report, it was very much in that spirit. It was thinking, and this was in the lead up to COP27. The climate meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and as you will remember, discussion was very much about this, and this was to some extent, you know, in the of course affected by what happened in Pakistan, but of course it was a much more general discussion about loss and damages and the right of the developing world and emerging world to get compensation for the damage to something that they had not been part of contributing to creating this problem, but were very much at the receiving end of those of the impact of climate change. And what we thought was that, you know, we couldn't add in a way so much to that discussion, because we thought that this is very clear that this has to happen, and there was some progress in Sharm el-Sheikh on establishing a fund. You know, still a lot of uncertainty of exactly who is going to pay and how much and so on. But there was some progress, and it was just that it was on the agenda, that people accepted that this is part of has to be part of the conversation. So what we wanted to do with this report was to say, you know, for this to happen, it is actually quite important that the policies that are pursued in developing and emerging countries are consistent with, or the more they are credible, these policies, the more likely it is that we will get these flows. So it may seem somewhat, you know, we are, or rather we should, it is really to get these flows going that we are advocating what I will describe now in a minute. So when we're talking about moonshots for the emerging world, it's really about trying to create policies that will generate these flows that are so justified and so needed to address the impact of climate change in so many countries, and in Pakistan being, you know, at the very top of those among those countries. So let me. So I think of course the overall message in the climate debate is that this transition to net zero is not happening fast enough, and we are way off the targets of the Paris Agreement, and it's you know, we are seeing more and more extreme weather events, and again, Pakistan doesn't need to be convinced about that. And when you look across the emerging and developing world, it is clear that also there's a very large fossil fuel footprint in the emerging world. State-owned enterprises, state-owned financial institutions are very overrepresented in the fossil fuel sector. There's quite little innovation in terms of new green innovation in green tech and so on. And that's, so we are arguing for this mission-driven what we call Moonshots, and that we're trying to enhance state capacity to both transform state institutions, but also by transforming state institutions, we can allow to mobilize the private sector and make sure that without them, we cannot address this and we cannot solve it, and we need to create the conditions for that. So here's just a very quick summary of the main messages, and then I'll try to give you some more specifics. So really what we are saying is that in many emerging and developing countries, these state institutions are incredibly important. Unfortunately, they are often laggards today when it comes to this transition. They must go from laggards to leaders. They must be part of divesting from that those fossil fuel intensive industries to go into renewables. They must be part of not necessarily completely new green technologies, but be part of absorbing technologies that come from elsewhere in the green sector. We need to get the private sector involved, otherwise it's not going to work. And it's not just about capital, it's about skills, it's about experience, it's about energy, about dynamism. But the condition has to be right. And here's where the state capacity comes in again. It's so important that we get the good sides of the private sector, and not this part of the private sector has to do with corruption and capture and so on. We really need to get the private sector participation right. The third element is the adoption of green technology. And the minister actually mentioned something that I'm quite concerned about. We are now pushing out these green technologies around the world and in many developing countries. And we forget that this also requires a lot of adjustments in the rest of the energy systems for these technologies to really work to the full effect and really for also have the full impact. You know, often you want consumers and producers and so on using these technologies to be able to regulate their consumption and so on. There are a lot of things that have to happen. Transmission systems have to work and so on. All that we need to get technologies in, and we need to make sure that those technologies are absorbed. They don't necessarily have to be invented, or probably most of the time will not be invented in developing countries, but they need to be accessible. We need a carbon price. So again, this is very easily said, but it is not so easily implemented, and it's very controversial when we think through the implications of a carbon price. And a carbon price, I hear talk about a meaningful carbon price that will really impact decisions. But we're going to need it, because that's really the way that we regulate consumption, that we regulate how different users reduce their footprint. But also very importantly, that's how we drive the innovation, how we drive the absorption of these green technologies throughout the economy. We have no other tool really for driving that across the economy. But that's not going to be enough. We're going to need also a meaningful, I mean, beyond the meaningful carbon price, we're going to need to have also coordination. And that's, of course, the real challenge for state capacity, is to achieve that coordination, to bring together the public sector and the private sector, in PPPs, within sectors, across sectors. It is going to be a real challenge, but it's necessary. Otherwise, we will not succeed. And that's where we have to start thinking about how to make this work. And finally, and this is incredibly important, and it's last here, not because it's the least important, it's actually, I think, the most important part. And it was part of the minister's message also, I think. To really make state capacity work, it has to be based on trust and sense of support from the population. And if this net zero transition happens in a very disruptive way, and it happens in a way so that some people gain a lot and others lose out, that's not going to help build support for this. It's not going to make this sustainable. There will be a lot of reversals, and that's what we don't need. So that is an absolutely key feature of this policy. And now, so this is kind of theoretical list, but I'll give you one example now of something that is from the real world, something that I think corresponds quite closely to what I've described now. It's taken from Egypt. So you remember, Egypt was a host of the COP27, and it has, through, I think, quite a creative collaboration between the Ministry of International Cooperation, the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Energy and Water, and they have created this platform, country platform. I later, maybe in discussion, I can go into more about this, but what they have done is they've taken all the projects in the renewable space, solar and wind, and there's a lot actually going on in Egypt. Egypt has very good conditions for both solar and wind, and they put them on this platform. So now everyone knows this is what Egypt wants to do over the next 10 years, basically. These projects is, all the international development partners know what this is. The private sector knows what this is. The different ministers knows what the plans are. And I'll come back to why this is important. At the same time, they also have these phasing out program of fossil assets. And so with just transition programs, and here there is both about retraining, reskilling workers, but also maybe some of them are also getting early retirement. They work with a whole range of partners, but the main multilateral development banks they work with is EBRD, AIIB, and European Investment Bank. So they have been able to get concessional finance from the US for the compensation to the just transition of the fossil fuel sector. So they have got support for that. From Germany, they have a very interesting arrangement where they have something we call performance-linked debt. So they get better lending conditions by committing to do something on climate change. So basically what Germany is saying, we can get more, we can do more to improve the global climate by lending money to Egypt to implement some projects, and so that's and by putting all this for everyone to see, and particularly for the private sector to see, Egypt has been able to convince some of the producers of inputs into these renewable sector, which is one of the big issues now, is that almost none of this production of renewables is happening in the emerging world. By doing this now, for the first time, there is a German producer of blades for wind power establishing production in Egypt. And I think that's a good illustration of why this is a very promising approach. I think you got now the basic message, and I will go through a few things, and then we can have a discussion on this. But just I spoke a little bit about the sort of base or origin of state capacity, and there's a lot of interesting work going on here, but as it goes back to this point I said about the transition has to be smooth and just, and the more we learn about state capacity, is really about trust in government and trust among people, both what we call generalized trust among people, but also particularly trust in government and government institutions. And how we build that is absolutely critical for state capacity, the capacity of institutions to function. So if we look at now the different state institutions, so what we are asking countries to do, to look at, what are the institutions that you have where the state has an influence? Well, there are the state-owned enterprises, and we know they are, very important in many of these countries, and they are important for finance. We looked at, a lot of transactions. We have a very big data set that we have merged and looked at, and we can see that SOEs are very important for fundraising. They also get cheaper funding than the private sector, and that gap between state and private is larger, as you would expect in emerging and developing countries than in advanced economies. So it's particularly important to get these to work for the net zero transition in developing countries. The state-owned financial institutions are very diverse. You have the national development banks, you have the sovereign wealth funds, you have the central banks. Your central banks, you may think is not so important, but actually they are becoming around the world now drivers of the net zero transition. I was just at a meeting before coming here in Assam, where the central banks and Ministry of Finance came together. I can tell you that the central banks are driving the ministries of finance throughout the world now, because they have seen this as the risks involved for the financial sector coming from climate change are very, very important. The advantage of the state-owned financial institution, they can take on large projects. They can take on large projects with longer tenors, with longer finance conditions. And they can help also bring in the private sector. They can provide some comfort for the private sector. So this is important. Unfortunately, this is not what they do today. So today, when we look at state-owned enterprises, as I said before, they are heavily overrepresented in the fossil fuel sector. Don't go into details here, but the same thing is when you look at the state-owned financial institutions, they are very much into oil and gas or more into oil and gas than private institutions. So I said it before, they have to go from laggards to leaders. They must be part of this process now, greening value chains and decarbonizing value chains. They must be part of mobilizing private capital. So all these issues that we have talked about for so long, reforming state-owned enterprises and reforming state-owned financial institutions, gets another kind of imperative now because of the need to drive the net zero transition. So it's not the new agenda in a way, but it gets more, hopefully a stronger coalition behind these reforms. And that, I think, is critical. I'm not going to say. I said it earlier, the importance of bringing the private sector. We're talking about amounts of capital, but also, skills and experience that's needed to make this work. And it's going to be very important to get the right thing out of the private sector, what kind of framework you are building. So it's about governance, it's about competitive bidding, it's about robust contract management. We know that contracts, particularly in the renewable sectors, are very complex, and having capacity to manage those contracts is very important. And one graph that I liked a lot is that, when you have as a public, as a regulatory policy to that, when the electricity tariffs are set by the most efficient supplier, renewables have a much higher share of energy. That to me says something about the value of regulation and how it can drive efficiency and decarbonization. I won't say much about this. It's really about the green technology, and the basic point here is that unfortunately very little, with the exception of China, is happening in the emerging world when it comes to patenting of green technologies. This is not what we are expecting. What we need is to make sure that these technologies become available. It's a bit like the vaccine discussion that the minister was mentioning. We need to make sure that these technologies becomes generally available and not appropriated just to some rich countries. These technology, we need to have a fair and open trade in these. And we need to have frameworks. That should be the focus of policies in emerging developing countries, frameworks that emphasize innovation and adoption. We need carbon pricing. We need to emphasize access to finance and technology, and of course, help international support for this is very important. So before I end with a couple of examples, I just give you some elements of state capacity. I use that term quite a lot by now, but there were sort of three elements that we kind of identified as sort of key features of what we mean by state capacity. One is credibility, one is coordination, and one is expertise. So to give you a sense of what we mean by credibility is the ability of governments to stick to a policy, and here emissions pricing and reducing fossil fuel subsidies is not something that you are completely unfamiliar with in Pakistan. This is where state capacity becomes so important to stick to be able to do this and compensate in a more efficient way those affected by rising energy prices. Coordination, really making sure that you have a dedicated body that is there to monitor and make sure that the implementation happens. And of course, for some of these technologies, you need very dedicated expertise, and to get these public-private partnerships working, for example, you often need a dedicated unit that really understands the complexity of this and can transfer experience from one sector to another or from one part of the country to another. So having that expertise is also part of building state capacity. We went through three countries. I won't dwell on this now. I think it's better to have a panel discussion, but I can very quickly run through. So India, the story is very much, private sector has done, or renewables is all about private sector. State sector with maybe one or two few exceptions are in the fossil fuel sector. There's a lot of variety in the fossil fuel intensity across sectors and across different SVs, so that just suggests there's a lot of room for improvement. Green finance is almost nowhere, so there's a lot of things to be done, but it's picking up, and there is some sense of things taking off when it comes to green bonds, for example. Indonesia, as you know, was the previous G20 presidency. It has gone through quite a lot of reforms in the state-owned and state-owned holding companies, but it hasn't really managed to use this to push renewables, and it has helped to involve the private sector, but it hasn't really encouraged the green transition very much. China is a long story, but one thing that we found there was that the state-owned enterprise reforms were they were effective in when it came to. So privatization was quite effective when it came to driving efficiency of state-owned enterprises. But what really helped when it came to and the environment, and of course you know a lot about the air pollution and so on. What was really helped there was the change of evaluation methods of state-owned enterprises, and that's maybe something that can be replicated elsewhere, even though, of course, China is very particular in how they recruit and promote managers for SVs. But and China, of course, has also been able to launch its emissions trading system. It's still very much in its infancy, but there is a hope that it will take off. So let me summarize. Moonshots for the emerging world is about applying emissions-driven policy framework. It's about building state capacity, reforming SOEs and state-owned financial institutions, and using state capacity to mobilize private sector skills and capital. Developing technology adoption frameworks is about facilitating globally to grant access to finance and technology, and ensuring a smooth and fair transition. So for us as a development institution, we need to be much better at working across different parts, across project and sectors, and engaging more with SOEs and state-owned financial institutions, and put more emphasis on crowding in the private sector. We need to develop capacity to help build state capacity. Every infrastructure project has some element of capacity building. We need to expand that and become better at that. I think more established development banks have much more experience from that, and we need to become better at that. Supporting green technology and technology transfer is something that we have tried to become particularly good at, to try to be part of taking new technologies into traditional infrastructure, something that we know is the infrastructure sector is quite poor at doing. And of course, in this area of green technology, it's particularly important. I think that's something that we need to do even more of. And of course, we need to be part of helping governments to achieve this coordination. We were part of that Egyptian experiment that I mentioned. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berglof. Before we move to the panel, I would request the audience if there are any questions from the report. Please raise your hands and we can move the mic around. May I please request to keep the questions short?
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for this very nice presentation. I just have a short question. I didn't get the point about the report. Is it about, what's your strategy? Is it about incentivizing or monitoring and analyzing this transition, or is it being directly involved in making the policy with the government? You're sitting with the government and making this policy about it, or do you just want to incentivize this transition? Can you please clarify on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really excellent presentation. My quick question is that, in your opinion, developing countries like Pakistan, can we extend this model of financing the clean and green energy, where we can provide certain debt swaps to these countries, where they can invest in those projects in which they can actually move closer to a net zero emission, because it's a benefit which is going to go all across the globe. So can we also include that kind of a financing facility where the countries with higher debts can actually be provided with some kind of debt swaps in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Just a very short question. Does AIIB, do they have a private sector arm as well? Do you lend directly to the private sector as well, or is it only through governments? Thank you.
Unfortunately, the Honorable Minister is not here. He made a very eloquent case for climate justice at the international and global level, and he pleaded the case of Pakistan's children who've been left behind because we have a very unfair global system. But my question is, all this conversation and his speech missed a very basic point of having climate justice within the countries like Pakistan. When we are talking about all the financial infrastructure which is making finances available for such projects as wind and solar energy, are we also trying to ensure simultaneously that these projects will not displace people from their land? These projects will not restrict people's traditional paths and traditional pastures that they have been using for centuries. Could there be any safeguards in this entire infrastructure development effort for that kind of a just transition that you have mentioned in your slides, but I would like to elaborate more on that.
We'll take one last question and then we'll move to the answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question would be actually in extension to the question from Sir. Thank you for your question as well. I want to know, since Pakistan is a kind of a country that is agricultural based and not very much advanced in technology, can we consider nature-based solutions, especially after they are being acknowledged in the COP27 as a solution to climate change? Thank you.
So thank you very much, and I'll be very quick because I want to hear the panel also. On the first question, so do we want to incentivize or do we want to get involved in coordination? So I'm not sure I exactly get the question, but there are two ways of thinking about it. One is what the report is really directed at governments or societies in emerging and developing countries, and we're talking about what should governments set out. So and I gave you the example from Egypt. You know, it has decided that in this space of energy transition, it sets out this vision, and then it tries to bring together all its international development partners. It brings in the private sector. It brings in some of its also some international its international lenders and so on. That to me is very much a coordination. Incentives are extremely important, and that's where I've emphasized the carbon price, and so I think you need a combination. I don't think it's a in terms of our own role. I think our own role is these policies have to be owned by governments, and governments that are responding to the needs of the people that they represent. Our own role can be to help facilitate transfer experience from other countries, bring in new partners, perhaps sometimes into countries. So I don't want to overemphasize our role in this. The question on debt swaps, absolutely, this is something that I'm very excited about and hope that to be able to contribute to. We have some concrete proposals inside the organization, but I'm also on the advisory board of something called Nature Finance, which is explicitly trying to think of how we can do this. So it's both. You can think of it as a whole new way of thinking about development finance. So it's about sort of acknowledging that there are a lot of opportunities in emerging developing countries for contributing to climate change mitigation or also climate change adaptation or to biodiversity. And if we can, if these are properly valued, they can be used to lower lending, the cost of lending, or reduce debt levels in countries. I think this is a huge opportunity that has to be grabbed, and I think there are so many opportunities. And I look actually at Pakistan. I had some meetings this morning on some very interesting projects in this country that could potentially be part of something like this. And I looked at similar opportunities and other transactions in other countries that I think have successfully used this. So I think this is a really very promising route to go down. Very quick question, as a response to the question, yes, AIIB is very much also a private sector financing institution. We are aiming to have 50-50 by 2030. We are not there yet, but we are not so far off actually. And I'm very excited by that group of people. I worked myself at the EBRD for 9 years, and that had a very strong private sector part, but I was always missing the government part. I mean, we did work with states, but usually at the local level. at AIIB, we have the whole spectrum, and often you can see here from just thinking about climate, you need to work with state institutions, both at the national level and at the local level. You need to work with the private sector, bring it all together under one roof. Really no other institution has it like that. The World Bank, as you know, have IFC, which is a separate thing. So we think this is very exciting and something that we really want to develop. Climate justice within countries, absolutely critical. I think that is exactly what I meant by just transition and smooth transition. I didn't spend much time on it, and I'm sorry. I think it is an incredibly important issue. There's actually, I can recommend you that the Egyptian presidency, or as a follow-up to Egyptian presidency of the COP27, they have published a handbook on just transition, which has a lot of case studies that will really can illustrate of what this is all about. And it's almost always about transition, just transition within countries. I mean, there's of course also the issue that we started with, you know, the right for countries that are being affected by climate change now to get compensation for each country. But it's a much bigger issue, I think, and the foundation for what I'm talking about here, to get these kind of the moonshots to really work, they need to be grounded on just transition and within countries. That's how you build real state capacity when you build trust among people in the policy. Agricultural based society, you know, one of the saddest things for me, I think, is that, and one thing that I hope to change in some small way at AIIB is that we don't do agriculture, because I think when you think about all the opportunities when it comes to agriculture to address both the climate issue and also the nature biodiversity issue, there are so many possibilities. And having said that, I think we are very much interested in nature-based solutions, even if we cannot operate at the moment directly in agriculture. Actually, I should be careful, because we are actually having some projects that are related to agriculture, and we can touch on it. We are doing something on zoonotic surveillance, for example, you know, monitoring viruses and so on, and that's related to husbandry and so on. So we can get into that, and I think we're going to get into this more and more. And nature-based solution is something we are very much working on. Actually, the next report, that our next flagship, is going to be on that, more or less. So it's going to be on thinking about how we can use nature to you know, how we can think of infrastructure to enhance nature, and how nature can enhance infrastructure. So we'll see. We will know a lot more ourselves, at least in a year's time, exactly what can be done and not be done. But that I agree, this is a huge potential. And again, going back to the question on debt nature swaps and so on, that I think it's a huge opportunity for Pakistan. And there are some really absolutely fascinating projects in this country that deserves support, and we'll see if we can get involved in some way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berglof. Can we take a couple of minutes as break and wait for the panel to settle down before we begin with the panel? Thank you. Before we begin the panel, I'll briefly introduce our panelists for today, and then we'll go around the panel once. We request the panelists to please share their views on the topic for a couple of minutes each. Our first panelist, Dr. Adil Najam, is Dean Emeritus and a Professor of International Relations and Earth and Environment at Boston University. Dr. Adil Najam is currently the inaugural Dean of the Frederick S. PIDE School of Global Studies at Boston University. He has previously served as the Vice Chancellor for Lahore University of Management Sciences. Our second panelist is Mr. Zafar Syed, CEO of Engro Fertilizers Limited, Pakistan's premier seed-to-harvest solutions provider and a subsidiary of Engro Corporation Limited. Mr. Ahsan started his professional career with Engro and then Exxon Chemical Limited, and his career spans over 30 years. Our third panelist is Ms. Simi Kamal, has over 40 years of experience as a geographer, a water and climate change professional, and a poverty alleviation specialist, and a women's rights activist. She has founded several institutions and has developed organizations in the private and NGO and public sectors in Pakistan. Currently, she's the chairperson of Hisaar Foundation in Pakistan, and the vice chair for the International Water Management Institute in Colombo, and co-founder and advisor and executive board member of the Panjwani Hisaar Water Institute at the NED University in Pakistan. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Nadeem Haque. Dr. Nadeem Haque is Vice Chancellor PIDE. He has previously served as Deputy Chairman Planning Commission of Pakistan. Dr. Haque has worked with the IMF for over 2 decades, and he has published over 5 books and over 50 research articles. May I then request Ms. Simi Kamal to go first, ma'am?
I had a chance to go through the report quite fast, and I spent some time looking at the ambit and scope of this report. And while I can see how important it is to look at net zero transition, perhaps Dr. Adil will agree with me that that's not enough right now. We have to do much more than net zero, because the thinking around net zero assumes that there is going to be only a 1.5 degrees centigrade rise in temperature this century, but we are seeing much more. So I think the problems that our AIIB is addressing perhaps are a lot bigger, and they are getting bigger a lot faster. So perhaps reports are finding it difficult to catch up with what's really happening. So also, while emerging and developing economies are being asked to do or take certain actions, which are all really good actions. Certainly, we need to do all of these things, and we need to do perhaps even more. So looking at the state-owned enterprises and how they must change, and the state-owned financial institutions, there are just a few things I'd like to say right now, and then perhaps we could take it up a little later. So the report speaks of trust building, and I think the minister who has gone away, I think it's a problem with ministers that they speak and don't listen, and if they don't listen, they are just going to carry on with what they think. So it is unfortunate that the minister isn't here to listen to what many of us have to say. But I do agree with him that there is this lack of trust that we must build. And in order to build this trust, there has to be meaningful engagement. And the meaningful engagement will only occur when people in the public and private sectors and in all the other social spaces, whether it be rebels or youth or women, or whether it is, in fact, in Pakistan, the army, which we can't leave out, or the others, we all have to speak to each other. And if we look at the way this engagement is carried on right now, I'm going to give one example. Let's just pick up the media. All the nonsense that goes on in the so-called talk shows and all the other stuff that comes through the other programming, we are told that we have to do this because the buying houses tell us that we won't get advertisements until we do XYZ kind of programming. And that advertising is dictated by the corporate sector. So what the corporate sector wants, this is what the buying houses do. I know it's very simplistic. And in the advertising business, the government, I think, is perhaps even a bigger player than the corporate sector in Pakistan. So let's just think while other people are talking, how do we even begin with that meaningful engagement so that reports such as these that give us some good ways forward could actually be actualized in Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Can we move on to Mr. Ahsan Zafar Syed?
Thank you, Mariam. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum. I went through the speech and I looked at the report also. And I think today's subject, which is Moonshot for Emerging World, is very relevant. I found out that there is a heavy focus on building state capacity, and there's a focus on mobilizing the private sector towards the net zero reality. But how can the private sector be mobilized is the real question towards net zero. So let me just take your attention to something. In the latest recent World Economic Forum, they identified the cost of living as the #1 crisis in the world at the moment. This risk of cost living has two components. Firstly, the economic crisis, and secondly, the climate change. And we cannot divorce economic crisis from climate change from each other, or we can leave one behind for the sake of other. Unfortunately, as far as Pakistan is concerned, we are seeing adverse effects of both the economic crisis and the climate change simultaneously. So if I throw some light on the economic crisis, our inflation at this moment is 27.6% on year basis in January 2023, which is the highest rate since 1975 in the last 48 years. Our food inflation is hovering around 32%. Our losses from the flood, at a mind-boggling $30 billion number. The rupee devaluation, that we have seen, the currency devaluation that the rupee has seen is at rupees 262 to 280 rupees. And in January alone, it is 10.6% at a record low. So if you talk about, I can keep going on and on. If you talk about your, fiscal deficit, it's $40 billion. If you talk about external debt, it's $32 billion. So there's a huge economic crisis in this country. And if I talk about the climate change, Pakistan is on the receiving end of the climate change effects. Even though we are responsible for less than 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but where we stand today. There is a very strong school of thought which prevail in the country that believes that given our low carbon footprint, climate change is not our responsibility. But another big population also believes that this is a myopic view, and Pakistan is 7th most vulnerable country to the climate change. So if you look at all of these situations, we are facing both these problems, and we need to see how we can create a balance and how to move forward. And I think once my turn comes in next, I will try to explain what can we do in this regard also. Thank you.
Dr. Najam?
Thank you. Thank you very much. My gratitude to AIIB for doing this, special to PIDE itself for hosting it. I am very glad that you're doing it. I first saw the report a few months ago when it first came out, and I do think that it is an important report. In a way, the world now has too many of these global reports. It used to be a time that there were one or two and everyone would focus on them. But despite that fact, it is an important report. It's particularly an important report for emerging and developing countries if they choose to focus on lessons from it. Now, this report, of course, is not the type of report that many of us are used to, which tell you what to do. It's a big picture flagship report for countries that want to learn. If they don't want to learn, they won't. But for countries who are interested in looking at not just climate change, but the idea of net zero and learn lessons from other countries, particularly in Asia, I think that's really the way to read the report, and that is what I congratulate AIIB on. Now, I should also say, and I hope you can see me smiling, Erik and Nadeem, in a way, the timing of this event could not have been worse. And you saw that in the minister's remarks. In many ways, you saw that in the questions. You'll probably hear it again. But it possibly could not have been worse. And I'll give you the reason. I joined Simi in that I wish we could find some way for chief guests to be actual guests. and listen to people. But that being so, why do I say it couldn't have been worse? Because right now, my AIIB colleagues and Erik, no matter what you say, the only thing on anyone's mind is not AIIB, it is IMF. Right? There are other meetings happening in the town you are in, and everyone is totally sort of awed and enamored by them. And I worry that in that moment that we are in, and I understand, in that moment we are in, we will lose the essence of what this report and what you are saying. In many ways, however, there is a link, and I put that in. As you heard in Musadik Malik's remarks, in many ways, once something comes from an international financial institution, there is this moment of grave concern about where international finance institutions are going in terms of many developing countries, not just Pakistan. And in this moment of many global crises, of which climate is one, of which inflation is another, of which geopolitical shifts are yet another, of which massive changes in our what we call the work of work is yet another, and so on and so forth. So this comes in that moment. I say this mostly because I fear that in that moment of our absolute concentration on what is happening in other rooms in Islamabad, we might lose the longer term perspective that this report presents, which is that if countries are going to take climate change seriously, then what are their options? It seems to me that the most important part, and there isn't a prescription, there isn't any prescription in this report that Pakistan should do this or that, but there is the implication sometimes derived, even if wrongly, that there is from the international community a mandate to go to net zero. Now, I will be honest, I am actually not a fan of the idea of net zero. And sometimes wonder if net zero is not zero. And the reason for that is that in many ways, it's a promissory note. It's a promissory note saying we will do something in 2070, right? Which is very easy. It's very easy for India or another country to say, we will go net zero by 2070. If I'm a politician, wink, wink, I'm not in power by that. And many of these promises are made not to be kept, much like other sorts of promises. So I'm much more interested in the type of immediate policy that can happen. But that, having said that, net zero is a major concept that the world is grappling with. And I do think that Pakistan, like all other countries in the world, developing or otherwise, and certainly in Asia, should be thinking about what is in our interest in this. If Pakistan is going to act on climate, Pakistan should do it not as a favor to the rest of the world, but for its own interests. I believe that interest is there. I believe that the purpose of these conversations should be to define that interest and to focus on that part of climate change that leads to Pakistan's interests. And that is why I think the partnership with PIDE is important. That is why the type of things that PIDE is doing with its Rasta program and with other work of really sort of connecting these global conversations to the immediate needs, to the long-term priorities of the people and governments in Pakistan. I've taken too long. Allow me to make one substantive comment, and I hope we can come later. Let me get out of the way. I found this graph in the report the most important one. And in many ways, I think while we have focused on net zero because that's what newspapers focus on and have trained us to focus on, I think the important lesson in this report is not about net zero, it is about state capacity. It is about SEOs in some ways, state-owned or enterprises, which is a very fraught conversation in Pakistan, but it's really about state capacity. And if you can look at this graph, you may not be able to see it on the screen, but it's in the report, which I hope people have with them and have read. Pakistan is, as you would expect, towards the right side of that curve. This ranks countries by state capacity. I don't think we need a graph for people in Pakistan to know that the state capacity is low. If anything, this graph seems to suggest it is higher than many Pakistanis would think it is. But the real question then is, for Pakistan, this is not a question AIIB can answer. This is a question that PIDE has to answer. This is a question people in this room have to answer. Do we have the state capacity
to meet the aspirations that we keep pontificating about? Do we have the state capacity to implement the grand policies that we keep talking about? And if we don't, if we do, very good. If we don't, what do we do to increase that state capacity? What do we do to build that state capacity? Without that, this focus on what is the right policy becomes at best academic and not even good academic in that sense. So I think if people in this room, and certainly for myself, the most important thing I take from this report is the primacy of state capacity to any policy in general, but certainly to the climate crisis. This crisis, much like any other policy, whether it is housing policy, whether it is land policy, whether it's agriculture policy, the angle on which the sword falls is not that we make the right policy choices or bad policy choices. It is that too. Yes, bad policy choices will lead to bad results. But even good policy choices without state capacity or without attention to state capacity will lead to bad results. That to me is the most important thing I learned from this report. And for that, I thank the AIIB.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Nadeem Haque.
Yeah, I think Adil made a very good comment. I think it's a very good report. Enjoyed it. Wonderful. But Erik, let me just tell you, we have a number of moonshots. We are a moonshot economy. We are given the moonshot of the energy crisis and we tried to solve it, and we've worked very hard at it. We put in every project that the World Bank told us, that everybody told us. We are over-projected on in that side. We have Asian Development Bank is building, I think, if I remember right, $2 or $3 billion worth of highways in Pakistan and flyovers. I think we have now more per capita flyovers than most countries in the world. We are building flyovers as if we are a car-rich country. In fact, the flyover mania has made sure that we can't walk in our cities. We can't bicycle in our cities. We have to buzz around in cars all over the place. And that's a moonshot that we've been living with for the last 50 years, ever since USAID and Doxiadis made this city for us. We didn't make the city, they made it for us. So we've had a number of moonshots. In fact, I would argue our moonshots vary almost every 5 years. It was only 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we were building the poverty moonshot. So we've got about, I think if I'm not mistaken, 20 agencies that are trying to solve the poverty problem by giving handouts. And we're doing it on a daily basis. So I can keep counting moonshots. Now, state capacity. Adil, I think you will recall, I mean, we've been talking in PIDE, especially I've been talking about this for 30 years. That there's only one fundamental reform this country requires. Okay, two. One is the civil service reform. We are still sitting with Lord Macaulay's bureaucracy with, those paper files and section officer going back and forth. And that bureaucracy is totally incapable of facing today's challenges. In the morning, you have a finance secretary, in the evening, you have an education secretary, then you have a health secretary. So, I mean, that's the state of the state capacity. But who am I to say anything? When all the state capacity is employed by DFID and by World Bank, etc., they are totally employees of those agencies. They work for them during their service, and they work for them after their service. So state capacity is owned by the donors. It's not even owned by us. Comes to policy, we really don't, I mean, I think all of you have known, and we've written about it many times. The last time that Pakistan made a policy, it was probably 1950 something. We've not made a policy. We only copy the policy that donors give us. And that is all we do. They tell us to, enfranchise women. We do that. They tell us to run around doing webinars or seminars on Gender budgeting, we do that. They tell us to do this, we do that. So that's our state capacity. In fact, I would argue, and many people, Adil, you might also agree with me, that we used to have a reasonably good irrigation bureaucracy, which has been stripped ever since irrigation bureaucrats left for the World Bank. So quite frankly, while the capacity building efforts have gone up, our capacity has gone down. Right now, private mobilization, we've also been through that round. We've been through the rounds of privatization. Unfortunately, it has multiplied our problems. We have built a competition commission on the say-so of the World Bank. In fact, we built 122 regulatory agencies on the say-so of the donors, which means we are falling all over ourselves. Do we have a market? Do we not have a market? But at the same time, we are not free to think for ourselves. So I don't know how we square the circle. And yet we are told, and maybe some of you can clarify for me, that we're the 7th most vulnerable country. I've not seen this study and I've not seen who's done it. Where did this figure come from? I'm being a little bit of a provocateur, but I'd like to know, how are we the 7th most vulnerable country? Please, somebody must clarify this for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Nadeem al-Haq said, my first question would be to, and this is following the natural progression of the argument that we have at hand right now. This is to Professor Adil Najam. Sir, your point about net zero and the whole idea and the politics surrounding it renders my first question to you moot. So I'll move to my second question, and it's in line with what Dr. Nadeem just said and what you said towards the end of your statement. I want you to discuss what, in your view, would be the ideal progression of reforms towards improving state capacity in terms of the climate change issues?
I wish I had the answer to that. I just am not that smart. इतना अक्लमंद नहीं हूं मैं कि इतने बड़े सवाल का मेरे पास जवाब हो. But the one part of your question that I might have a view on is, I don't think that state capacity for climate is any different from state capacity for irrigation or state capacity for education and so on and so forth. This goes back to some of the things. So yes, there are institutional differences. Yes, you can think about organizations, but if you start from there, then you end up where I think Nadeem was talking about. You end up on sector band-aids, right? We are interested in climate, so I will look at what is happening in country X, Y, Z. I am less angry on this than Nadeem. And so even if people are trying, so you look at sort of what is happening somewhere else and you try to copy it here. And that leads to this proliferation of agencies and regulatory apparatus, which is exacerbated by the type of things that were said. Not only that there is a market, I understand it, and I think people have a right to seek better employment. So you are half good in a developing country and therefore are picked up by an international institution, right? If things are bad in your own, you look for those opportunities. But there is also this proliferation. If you start proliferating organizations for regulation, you take good people and put it in them rather than on the productive side. So I've gone too far in that, but what I'm trying to say here is, I think starting with state capacity per se, the capacity to analyze, the capacity to prioritize, the capacity to do this in light of one's own national interests, and most importantly, the capacity to implement. Right? That is what the state is for. The ability to take an idea and to implement it in one way or the other. That really is the capacity we are talking about. I can give Nadeem al-Haq the answer of where this 7th or 8th most vulnerable comes. Every year I'm asked by Pakistani newspapers to comment on this. I always sort of cringe. So there is a report that the German aid agencies sort of do where they rank countries by vulnerability. That doesn't bother me. That's not very hard science. You can probably look at the same data and do an index and come to 11th or 12th. It is very clear that Pakistan is vulnerable. It is vulnerable because of its geography. We are based essentially on two major climatic forces. One is our monsoon, the other is the Himalayas. The two collide. and they give you a climate system that has been bountiful, that has given us our agriculture system. And those are both under threat with climate change, right? That's the climate science part of it. Where I do join Nadeem very much in this is that unfortunately, especially this last year, we've started talking about this as if it's a matter of pride. Right. And I worry that the rest of the world will also get tired of us sort of doing the victim part. Right. Even if we are 7, there are 6 others. And in fact, the problem with climate change is that it is happening all across the world. So the world's appetite is going to be very small to pay us, whether we cause the problem or not. That is why we have to Pakistanize. I think that's the message of this report. It is not saying do this for net zero. When I read it, it is saying, if you are interested in doing climate policy, then you have to do this sort of things, such as increase state capacity, right? So again, going back to state capacity, the state capacity that you need to stabilize the dollar is in fact the same or similar to the state capacity that you need to do climate policy. To me, climate policy in Pakistan will mean water policy. It will mean energy policy. It will mean things like load shedding. Again, very last point, I'm taking too long. Musadik Malik is a dear friend, and I have very high respect for him. But the story that he told about the possibility that some of this big blackout might have been because of the renewable in the system is a story about state capacity. Right? That you put in energy systems and don't have the capacity to deal with it, if that is in fact correct. It's not a story about bad technology. It is a story about the capacity to use technology, whether those are flyovers, whether those are roads, whether that is infrastructure. That match has to happen. That again is what I take from this report.
Thank you, sir. I would now request Ms. Simi Kamal to, and based on what Dr. Najam just said, I first want you to give us your reflections on what Dr. Najam just said. And based on what he said, Pakistan being one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change, and the recent floodings have obviously reiterated that fact. This is a layperson question. How much do you see a role of carbon emissions in this vulnerability?
Well, first of all, I agree with Adil's analysis completely. And, to put it very simplistically, last century was when we put carbon, the whole humanity put carbon into the atmosphere. And this century is when we are reaping its benefits or its rewards. And those, I'm saying benefits in inverted commas. So the rewards are all about its impact on water resources. So I completely agree with Adil that if we talk about capacitating, we have to talk about policy, it's about water, it's about energy, it's about other related areas. And yes, I agree with him that, I'm also really fed up of, wearing this badge of, it's not a badge of honor. We should be ashamed that we are so vulnerable. There are so many other countries that have similar problems, but our vulnerabilities increase precisely because of lack of capacity, because we don't plan, because we don't learn lessons from what we have already done. We don't use what we have, and we fritter away all the chances we get. For example, one of the really important things about capacity is the capacity to take from Pakistan's thinking nationals what they have to offer. These thinking nationals have cried hoarse, trying to say, here, this is something you can look at. Here, this is something you can do. But the complete apathy amongst these, and it's not just the bureaucrats, when we say, okay, the state, so well, who is the state? Because we've just heard that the bureaucrats are all working for donor organizations. So who is the state? And if there is a state, a functioning state, why is that state not listening to its own nationals who have been trying for the last 30, 40, 50 years, offering and proffering solutions and, better ways of thinking, coming up with the reports, coming up with recommendations that could be taken up. I'll give you a small example. We say, everything is donor driven. Yes, but why should it be? There was a bunch of Pakistani nationals who sat down and wrote the Citizens' Water Policy in 2016. Nobody paid us to do it. Okay. And we managed to do about 20 or 30 briefing sessions and getting inputs from others. And we went to the government and said, here, we've got something. It's for 10 years. It's got goals. It's got budgets. It's got a few things that can be done. Not everything under the sun being put into that. So many of us are now fed up. We are fed up because we want to work with the government. We want to work on capacitation. We want to help build this capacity for the government to interact with people who have a lot to offer. How do we change this and how do we break that? What's in this report? Some of the ideas that are here, how will they be taken forward if the government or the state is not willing to listen to people who will be able to add on to what is here in this report and to, come up with rational ways of solving some of our problems.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll move to Mr. Zafar Syed, sir. Now that we're speaking of non-state actors, particularly of the private sector, what do you think Pakistan can do to transition to net zero?
I'm sorry, say it again.
My question is, what can Pakistan do now to transition to net zero in terms of the role of the non-state actors in trying to mobilize the private sector?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariam. Pakistan can do quite a few things, even though there's a budget constraint, but that I will discuss later. I think there are at least quite a few things that come to my mind. Firstly, we should have an energy mix of renewable or indigenous fuels only. Means we should phase out the imported fuels and replace them with indigenous or renewables, and we should focus on expanding our renewable energy sector, such as hydel, solar, wind, and even biomass. That's number one. So energy mix should be correct. Number two is improve energy efficiency, and what I mean to say is that the government should implement policies and programs to promote energy efficiency in areas of buildings, transportation, and industry, and this will bring the overall energy consumption quite low. This will reduce the overall energy consumption. It will also affect the greenhouse gas emissions. And the third point is that the government should promote a sustainable transportation, which means encouraging electric vehicles or encouraging actually public transport system, as well as building sustainable transportation infrastructure, and this will bring the emissions down in the transport sector. Similarly, support to the carbon capture and storage, which means that the government should support the development and deployment of carbon capture and storage, and this will affect the emissions from the power plants and the industry. And similarly, we must invest in research and development in sustainable technologies, and that would accelerate if at all we want to go towards the net zero. We must implement policy reforms, and this would mean incentivizing, agencies or organizations that want to work in this direction, and also penalizing activities that contribute to the greenhouse emissions, so on and so forth. So, like the report has mentioned, that we must also foster international, technology transfers, things like that. But for all of this, whatever I just mentioned, I can go on and on. For all of that I've mentioned, we need, funds to the north of $100 billion for the first phase of green energy transition. And given the economic crisis that we have in the country, we clearly don't have the money, which means that if the world is serious about net zero, then they need to do a lot for Pakistan. And I can give you just few examples. For example, we need access to green climate funds. The green climate funds, which were established in 2010 by the United Nations for the developing countries to assist them in mitigating to the effects of climate change. This fund has gathered around $9.7 billion up till now. And since their inception, they have been able to implement only 4 big projects to the tune of around $131 million. So out of the 9.7 billion that they have gathered, they have only approved projects up till $131 million, at least commitment. And the actual disbursement is even low. In case of Pakistan, if I talk about Pakistan case with Green Climate Fund, for on an average, one approval with GCF takes around 538 odd days to get past the queuing phase, the pipeline phase. And after that, there is a board approval process. And in Pakistan case, on an average, it takes around 288 days. So all in all, for our country's case, to get past the approval stage, it takes around 826 days. This is no excess in real means. So I don't think it's of any use to us. The second thing is, climate reparations. Pakistan emits less than 1% of carbon emissions, whereas other countries like US emits more than 18%. If we look at per capita CO2 emissions for US, it's around 15 tons, 14.9 tons to be precise. And in Pakistan, it is around 1 ton per capita. So for net zero in Pakistan, you need 2 things. You need conviction and you need resources. As a Pakistani, I can say that yes, we have the conviction, but we don't have the resources. We just saw devastating floods last year, where the losses were to the tune of $30 billion. We also saw pledges getting made of around $10 billion. But out of those pledges, up till now, a couple of $100 million have materialized. So my hope is that if the world really wants us to go ahead with the net zero, the world needs to come forward and help Pakistan in this regard. Otherwise, this is very difficult to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This opens up several questions that we might not be able to discuss right now, but I'll quickly go to Dr. Nadeem Haque. And I know this since I work at PIDE that we've been working on the urban centers in Pakistan. Mr. Ahsan Syed spoke about encouraging public transport systems. And as you know, some of Pakistani cities are ranked amongst the most polluted in the world. What do you think, sir, is the state's role in this transition, particularly in terms of achieving net zero?
First of all, Mariam, I think for us, net zero is a simple goal, not at all difficult. We only use 0.5% of global carbon do we emit. So for us, it's very easy. It's not a difficult thing, but the question is at what price? For example, if you could only ban our cars, use of cars, you would get at least 0.25, 0.3 out of that. So we'd be very close to net zero. If only we could just simply use a little bit of insulation technology in our building, we'll get to net zero. So it's not difficult for us. But the problem is when loans are available, I think I go back to this, that Dambisi-Moyo thesis is very relevant here. Our government, everybody says they don't listen to us. Of course, Simi, they don't listen to you. But put the World Bank in the chair here and see our ministers sit here forever. Put DFID in the chair here and our ministers will sit forever. And you don't even need senior officials. You need very junior officials to sit here. So let's be clear. Fahim Jahangir, I don't know whether he's here or not. He's written a book on this, that we are beholden to donors. They make our policy. So one thing is very clear. We are not placing the accountability where it is due. The accountability is on the World Bank and these agencies to come and tell us, hey, what happened to that poverty? You built a poverty alleviation fund. What happened? That's been there for the last 25 years. And it's still operating. It's got a huge amount of money. It's going around, but poverty still there. Anyway, so Now let's move forward and think about it. Losses. Simi, you tell us that the ministers don't listen to us. The flood losses. The government won't let us, even the universities and our think tanks, ask, for example, estimate the losses. The losses also had to be estimated by the World Bank and the AIIB. So if all the work is going to be done by the consultants, why should they listen to us? So I think that's a very simple case. Now they came up with a 30 billion loss. Let me tell you a little story. At the time of 2010, I was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And all these donors, same thing happened. They came to me with losses of 40 billion. When you went through it very carefully, the losses turned out to be less than 10 billion. Later in the year, the losses turned out to be an advantage because the crop was better. So I think, quite frankly, there's a huge thing. Then they came back and they said they want to build back better. And there were huge amounts of figures there to build back better, this loan, that loan. And I looked at it as bizarre. For example, they wanted to build houses on platforms. They wanted to build new cities in the middle of the floodplain. I found that very bizarre. So we managed to cancel that. Question is, there are too many loan vendors in the city who are going to vend their loans. And they have the bureaucracy with them. When we tried to talk about civil service reform, Adil, in the framework of economic growth in 2012, who opposed us? The biggest opponents were the donors who said, no, you can't do this. You can't do this. You have to retain the same civil service from 1860 because that civil service serves our end very well. And a thinking community does not get together to say this. So we can talk about all these things, but the issues are deeply structural in Pakistan. Adil, it's the same issue that affects climate change as, for example, what is the issue behind our energy losses? We've suffered 7 trillion of energy losses. What is the issue? Governance, same thing, civil service. You go to education, we've got 30 universities, 300 universities around work. What is the factor behind that? Same thing, the civil service controls those things. We've got a deeply centralized system based on Lord Macaulay, which we are not ready to change. The same judiciary that thinks of the world the same way as Lord Macaulay thought. We are not willing to change that. And we don't have the constituency at home to change it because the constituency is not here, constituency is outside. I think this is the fundamental issue we need to grapple. This is the moonshot that we need, Erik.
Thank you, sir. I have one last question, and I'd direct it to either Professor Najam or Ms. Kamal. Either one of them can choose to answer. Again, it's a layperson question. Are climate mitigation strategies measures enough to reverse the climate change? If no, what kind of climate adaptation measures can be useful in terms of water management in Pakistan, and what might help towards decarbonizing the economy? Once we've had an answer to that, I would request one of the panelists to give us, those of us sitting here who are non-technical and don't understand the technicalities of the discussion we've had right now, to give us some insights into what are some of the key giveaways of this discussion that we've had right now. I think she's left because she was supposed to leave at 6.
Let me try to respond to this, and I will try also my best not to be cynical, because I think I come across too much as that, and I really am not. First of all, if I had a request to Erik on this report, it would be, I hope that AIIB will focus also on adaptation. For countries like Pakistan, a lot of what you're hearing is that there isn't that much that Pakistan can do at this point in mitigation. Pakistan has to actually grow its energy use. Right? Now, we can be cynical about net zero and so on and so forth because we are so close to zero. Actually, it's the less energy you use, the more difficult net zero is, because you have to grow. Right, and established large energy systems can actually move to that if you start taking net zero really seriously, which is really not about, net zero is not about reducing energy per se. It is about doing some conservation, but it is also the mix change and so on and so forth. So I do hope that we focus on adaptation, because as has been said by nearly everyone, Pakistan's principal challenges are going to remain in adaptation. But that doesn't mean that on the mitigation side, there isn't an opportunity. The opportunity is that as we grow energy, are we going to repeat the mistakes of other countries? Or is there an alternative Pakistani path? which allows energy poverty to be reduced, right? That this word hasn't been used. It should be. It is very important. For many people in Pakistan, the problem with energy is not just that we don't have energy, that the energy is polluting, but that the energy isn't there, right? You will need it for your economic growth. You will need it for development. You will need it simply for basic quality of life. So where does that come from? I do not think that argument comes from the international community. I really don't. It doesn't come from COPs. It doesn't come from the world telling us that we have to save it by net zero. I think, and this is where PIDE and others, me and you, have to sort of come in and say, okay, what is the Pakistani case for a net zero equivalent? I don't think that it will come from assistance. I do not think that we have the will, and the money is missing. Let me make one snide comment. I find it a little disturbing that the only time we talk about floods now is when we have foreigners in the room. We talk about floods when we go to Davos. We talk about floods when we have a donor in front of us. When was the last time you saw anything on Pakistan television channels on floods? When was the last time you read an op-ed or a research piece about the flood? So let us not use flood victims, as that either. But let me come to the serious point I want to make. What could be a possible Pakistan case for a net zero like thing? It won't be that we have to save the world. It will be the financial crisis we are in. So why are you in a dollar crunch? Why are you in a financial crisis? Largely because of loans. Very large part of that loan, not the largest, is because of our energy bill. The logic of renewable in Pakistan should not be COP27. The logic of renewables in Pakistan should be the indigenization of Pakistan's energy sources. There is no more indigenous Pakistani source than sun and wind. This is where state capacity comes in. We have to ask these tough questions. I hope there are researchers in the room. We researchers have to ask, why is it that putting solar energy in Pakistan, listen to this one carefully. Why is it that putting solar energy in Pakistan costs 3 times as much as in Abu Dhabi? Abu Dhabi, not China, not Spain, not US. In one of the most oil-rich countries, you can put up solar panels for 1/3 the price. Now, that is either corruption or it is inefficiency of the state capacity that we've been talking about, right? It boggles my mind. Spain can have an entire day on renewable. Denmark can have an entire day on renewables. In Pakistan, we were just told that our whole grid might have gone because we had 2 windmills or something like that, right? That is the question. If we make climate something that we will do it if you pay us for it, I think that is a ridiculous argument. That we will only care about climate if someone pays for it. No one is going to pay for us it, and we shouldn't do it even if they do. We should care about the climate if we care about the lives and livelihoods of people of Pakistan. So I think the case for renewables, for example, has to be made on energy grants. I think the case for EVs, if EVs is to be made, has to be made on Pakistani grants. I think the best case, and this will be the last point on this one, I think Nadeem maybe, or maybe it was Simi, quickly pointed it out. I think the greatest scope Pakistan has in terms of climate action, in terms of carbon emissions and mitigation, is in the building sectors. Is in how we build. It is in insulation. If you want one word, even more than energy, it is insulation. We essentially build homes to cool and heat so that we can lose the cool and heat, right? So my apologies for the long response, but what I'm saying is, if we are going to respond to these things, we have to make it our issues.
Thank you so much, sir. And it was Mr. Syed. He spoke about the infrastructure management in terms of energy crisis. I will now open the floor for questions. I would again request if the questions could be kept short. I was also told there's some hands raised on Zoom. I'm not sure if you can take those questions.
I have a question. I'm Ashraf, and I'll take from where Dr. Adil Najam just left, and his word was insulation. And he also mentioned of the domestic sector energy consumption, which happens to be notoriously bad in Pakistan. We have upward of 47% energy going into the domestic sector, which is compared with 24% going to the industrial sector. It should supposed to be otherwise. But over the years, the construction practices and everything else goes with it has put us in a situation where the summer peak loads and the capacity charges and all those things have actually ruined the energy sector, both for gas in winters and electricity during the summers. The answer to it, this is, in my opinion, pretty simple given the Pakistan's climatic advantage and other advantages. We have been talking about the solar and wind energies, but surprisingly, there wasn't a mention of geothermal energy. Now, geothermal energy in Pakistani context is not as per the Western context, where the climate is cold and you have to dig a few kilometers down to get the temperatures of 300 to 400 degrees to actually bring in the steam for driving turbines or for the district heating. In Pakistan, right where this seminar is going on, 15 feet below that, the temperature is 23.2 degrees centigrade. All we need is using this very geothermal energy as heat exchange, and we can have the answer to the domestic sector peak load in summers and also gas peak load during winters by utilizing the geothermal energy in the passive manner as primary agent for cooling and heating in Pakistan. Now, that is one area I would like the panel to actually advise us and guide us, and also a food for thought for the others to think in context of Pakistan or construction material.
Thank you, sir. Can we move to the next question, please?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to all the panelists for the talk. I just felt, and it's a very brief thing, if we open the word vulnerability in the context of floods, we see that they started from South Punjab and they went on in Sindh. And there are two major structures, physical structures. One is Chashma Right Bank Canal, almost 300 kilometers long concrete structure that we have built right in front of the actively building floodplain in the southern Punjab. And then we have built another formidable structure called LBOD in Sindh. Both are disastrous, both stop extremely destructive floodplains. There were people who raised their voices against these structures, and these are not the structures which Pakistani government has built. The Chashma Right Bank Canal has been built by AIIB, LBOD has been built by World Bank. So I think this overall narrative of calling Pakistani state always inefficient or Pakistani bureaucrats or the state incapacitated, I think we need to be a little more just and fair in the distribution of the blames that we finally allocate to various players. Because in the case of at least these two structures, which caused all the havoc, which is now being estimated 30 billion or 15 billion, whatever it is, they are directly attributable to these international donors who did not listen to local players, who did not listen to NGOs, civil society voices, local voices. And so why not? They should be punished for these projects. I mean, this is very simple.
I'll just add to this question. Most of the power sector woes in Pakistan are owed to the great, wonderful policies by the World Bank in Pakistan since 1950s. They built big hydro when they wanted to build big hydro. And now we have big hydro, which is not really performing optimally. And then in the 1990s, they gave us IPPs, which have massive capacity payments built into their contracts. And even in 2010s, when they again wanted us to set up plants on natural gas, we again were saddled with this massive energy capacity payment problem. And these two massive problems have developed what we call circular debt. So I think when we think about all the problems that we have, yes, the state has no capacity at all. The state, in fact, does not need a reform. It totally needs a real restructuring from the ground. But at the same time, we also need to raise this question that our donors have been saddling us with debts that we cannot pay on projects, on policies that have never delivered.
Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, we'll move to the panel. I think Mr. Syed wanted to respond to the first question.
Okay, so to answer the question, very passionate question. Thank you. Actually, I had the privilege to work on doing some analysis on the flood on my own. Nobody asked me to do it. I'm the chief executive of Engro Fertilizers and doing something in the agri space. So the conclusion and the root causes that we were able to figure out, the most important root cause of the havoc that happened after the flood was the choking of 3 out of 4 drains. You mentioned LBOD, but you did not mention RBOD. There are 4 big drains that can take the water, the drainage water into the ocean or to dispose of. So what happened was that the first part of RBOD was built up till the lake, the Manchar Lake, but the second part, which was to come downstream of the lake, was never built. So the lake overflowed, number one. Number two, you mentioned about the LBOD. LBOD is constructed in a way that it can take water to the ocean. But if you build unauthorized buildings in the way of LBOD or RBOD, the water will have no space to travel. So actually, there were unauthorized constructions in the drain channels which would take water to the ocean. This would have happened because of the monsoons and the Himalayans, flash floods, but of a much lesser extent. That's number one. Number two is that the world, not just the World Bank, the international consultants, the local consultants, so I'm not differentiating between the two, but I'm saying the experts have identified areas in our mountain ranges to build very cheap water catchments. And I'm not talking about water dams, I'm talking about water catchments. And the lack of having those water catchments created havoc. The water got accumulated because of these mountains, and then it couldn't hold on and just came in as a flash flood. So it was lack of having drains, lack of having all these catchment facilities because of this happened. There is no question that our glaciers are having colder temperatures in winters and much hotter temperatures in summers. So our glaciers were 7 degrees colder in the winter, like in March or April, and our glaciers were 5 degrees hotter in the month of June. Because of this change, the glaciers melted, in an extraordinary manner, but even the rivers did not cause havoc. It was simply the monsoons and the lack of having drains. That's to answer your first question. And on the second question, again, very nice question. When you mentioned about the IPPs and the capacity payments, I agree that there is an issue of circular debt. But if you see any kind of report, there are maybe 5 or 6 huge 100 pages worth of reports written after a lot of analysis. 60% of the circular debt in the energy sector is coming from the inefficiencies of your discos. And out of your 10 discos, 3 discos, out of the 10 discos, only 3 discos are contributing 86% of the losses related to the circular debt. So it's the inefficiencies of those discos, mismanagement of discos, the transmission losses, the thefts, the pilferages, lack of payment, all kinds of issues, which is known to everybody in the government. It is just the will which will make this happen. So it's a complicated issue, but just putting blame on the capacity payment, I think capacity payment is also adding on to it, but it's a very minimal chunk of it. The 60% is coming from distribution losses, and then the differences between the tariff adjustments, which cause around 10-15%, which makes it to 80%, 75-80%. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Najam, sir, would you like to give us your final reflections or answer any one of the questions?
I won't go into any of the questions. I think there is some validity in all of them. I'll take very briefly. I do think our children will be using geothermal. I have not, so technologically, scientifically, this is something that I think is certainly in the future and has been talked about and worked on for a number of years. From a cost perspective, I think it will take a little time. But I think we should be looking at new technologies and so on and so forth. But most importantly, I think we need to start with our issues. I'll repeat what I've said. We need to start with our issues, our priorities, our agenda. But that doesn't mean that our agenda has to be opposite someone else's agenda, right? We might come to the same conclusions. But if we come to it through our analysis, there will be much greater buy-in, and that buy-in itself will create the capacity. I think if I take away, in some ways, kide nikalna kab tak nikalenge? So if you win this argument of how everyone else is bad, then what? We are still in a mess, right? So somehow we have to get past the argument of who is at mistake and whose fault it is, and to come to the place of where we are trying to think, okay, ab karna kya hai? What do we have to do, right? And that place, I think, can only come from internal analysis based on our own interests. I have no doubt we have the capacity for it. I'm not sure we have the will, because that to me is the most important thing. Unless climate is seen as our own problem, as our own challenge, that doesn't mean it's a problem we created. It is a problem. It's a matter that it is a problem we face. We will keep going in circles trying to find out whose fault it is, who's going to pay for us for it. And meanwhile, you are living through one of the biggest changes in the energy mix that the world has seen. Now you can either be on that train and benefit from it, or we can be spectators. I hope we will be the former. I wish everyone the best. And thank you again for having me part of this dialogue.
Thank you again, sir. On that glorious note, I'd request Dr. Nadeem Haque for his concluding remarks.
Adil, I take your point very well, but just think about it. It's not as if we at PIDE and certainly Rasta and certainly PSD, we've been working very hard to establish domestic agenda. Our domestic agenda, yeah, climate is an issue, but I think we've got very important issues. For example, the country's come apart thanks to the politics of the country. I mean, even before the climate does anything to us, our politicians are going to screw us. They're going to kill us. And we are talking about political reform. Again, for example, take the civil service reform. We've talked about it ad infinitum for the last 30, 40 years. We've talked about many issues that are very important. I think that's the domestic reform agenda you're talking about. And I think that agenda we are trying to establish and we are trying to talk about it. Unfortunately, the problem is the money goes to climate change. So everybody wants to talk about climate change. Nobody wants to talk about a domestic agenda. I thank Erik and AIIB to at least mention public sector capacity, which we have been systematically eroding and killing for the last 50, 60 years, systematically. And I think we've written about that often enough that this is being eroded, very simply. IMF is in town. IMF is my old institution. I worked with them for 30 years. I know them very well. But IMF is sitting here in this hotel, running out in a car, talking to Ministry of Finance and comes back, doesn't talk to anybody in academia or any other agency in the country. Yes, that's true. Now, so please, maybe we haven't talked enough about the floods. But for God's sakes, who's talking about civil service reform? Who's talking about judicial reform? Who's talking about market reform? Who's talking about all the many things that are destroying our economy? Net zero will come in 70, 80 years. But economy, whether we'll survive the next decade is right now the main issue. And yes, we are talking about it. We've also written about the kind of fund program that we want. But who do we engage on that? So that's an open issue, Adil. Maybe you should come back on that. The second issue is insulation versus geothermal, etc. I would like you to understand, PIDE has been working on it and we've talked about it a lot. It is not neither geothermal nor insulation is going to do anything for us. Currently, Islamabad has a diameter of maybe 100 miles. Lahore has a diameter of 300 miles. Karachi has much more. Our cities have become the biggest sprawls in the world. Why? Because of poor city regulation on the part of the same old bureaucracy. It goes to the same thing. Our answer may lie, most importantly of all, to move away from what we call plotistan, the plot culture, to flat living, dense cities, which we are refusing to create because the bureaucracy thinks that's not important, and because they've got money to build roads, they've got cheap financing to build roads, so they will build roads ad infinitum. Coming to the inefficient discourse, absolutely correct, the discourse are totally inefficient. What is the issue? We've just written a book on it, and we're just trying to engage everybody with the book on that. Who do we engage? Adil, I'd like to know. Discourse are inefficient. We've worked on it for the last 10, 15 years. We've talked about it. Discourse are inefficient because all the disco heads are sitting in Islamabad pandering to the secretary. For God's sakes, when are we going to let the discourse be independent, run by professionals, answerable to professionals, and not to boards of civil servants? I mean, that's a critical first issue that we need to talk about. Unfortunately, when we talk about that, people say we are cynical. So I don't know what to do. Which issues should we address? Should we sing about floods, which come once in 10 years? Or should we talk about the disco that are killing us today? Should we talk about the sprawl, city sprawl that is killing us today? Should we talk about the agricultural system which the bureaucrats control, which is killing us today? These are the issues that we are trying to raise on the same level as climate change. And I would argue that they may even be more important than climate change, and perhaps we should talk about them. What is so wrong with us asking that we should talk about these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank the panel. It's been wonderful that you took this report so seriously and that you looked at the suggestions and thought about it. And I took down a lot of notes. So I very much hope that it certainly helped me to think through some of the issues. But I just wanted to, and particularly even the Nadeem's last comments, I think it's Adil Najam's interpretation of what we were trying to say is exactly right. This may be about climate, and it is about climate, but it's really about building state capacity, and state capacity is, I think, what you're talking about. You know, when you're trying to address these issues that are on your, on your mind, and probably much more directly than net zero. What we are saying is that net zero offers an opportunity to create a new coalition or an enhanced coalition for addressing some of these issues. And actually, when you talk about civil service reform, I think that is very much part of building state capacity. That's how you build professional bureaucracy. That's how you recruit the right people into office and so on. So I thought that for me it was very encouraging that this basic message of the report is that, of course, we will talk about specifically what needs to be the net zero, because I think it is going to help countries like Pakistan to get to address some of the issues and get maybe the support that it deserves. But it's really more about connecting development and climate and showing that there's no such, or there's too much made out of this conflict between climate and development. It's really, these are very much connected, and we won't make progress on the climate agenda if we don't make progress on the development agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berglof. And on behalf of PIDE and the AIIB, I would like to thank all our guests, and particularly our panelists for having spare time out of their busy schedules and being here today. Thank you so much, everyone.